Martin Heidegger is largely considered to be the greatest of the existentialist philosophers, although he did not accept the term. His monumental work, Sein und Zeit, or Being in Time, published in 1927, is among the more original philosophy books in the modern era. It was intended by its author to be the first part of a project that promised a revolution in ontology, the study of being, in its different analysis of man, an analysis that dispenses with defining him as a rational animal or thinking thing, and having his intellectual capacity constitute his essence. Although admitting that intellectual endeavors are part of our capacities, and that such is what we are at least part of the time, Heidegger instead seeks to probe man and define him in terms of what he calls his everydayness. In doing so, he will also seek to explain how man has a world in a more practical sense than simply having a world of nature to be studied, but also a world of his dealings and his relationship to that world that is, in a sense, his world. Heidegger proposes a new term for man, which he calls Dasein. From German, this word can be translated as existence, but another element that Heidegger will use extensively is that it is also composed of two separable words, da, meaning there, and sein, which is the infinitive of the verb to be. Some kind of there to be or being there fits in well with Heidegger's project because he envisions Dasein as something that has a there as part of its ontological constitution, that in ontology, the study of being, it is constitutive of Dasein's being to have its there, because for Heidegger, Dasein is always being in the world, never outside of its world. And this fact, he believes, has the significance that an ontological analysis of Dasein must take it into account at the beginning. The basic fact one needs to recognize is that Dasein can be in many ways different from a tree or a hammer. Dasein is aware of its existence, and is the being for whom its existence is an issue, in such a way that Heidegger will argue that existence is Dasein's essence. This is not exactly the same doctrine contained in how Jean-Paul Sartre defines existentialism, by stating that existentialists estiment que l'existence précède le sens, ou, si vous voulez, qu'il faut partir de la subjectivité. Heidegger's thought is compatible with this, in the sense that for him, Dasein's existence is in each case mine, and that Dasein is not just being, but also becoming, in that Dasein projects itself toward a future potentiality for being. In Heidegger's words, we cannot define Dasein's essence by citing a what. Its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case it has its being to be, and has it as its own. This being to which Dasein comports itself, Heidegger calls existence. He emphasizes Dasein's way of being that comports itself to its existence, rather than the question of what the essence is or when essence exists, as if it were a property of an entity. It is in the introductory section about the formal structure of the question of the meaning of being that Heidegger defines Dasein as the entity that is confronting the question. And he says on what is page 7 of the original, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, and as such it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely, being. This entity which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give a proper explication of an entity, Dasein, with regard to its being. In doing so, he is explicitly doing two things. First, he is separating Dasein among other entities as being the entity that is doing the questioning. Secondly, he is signaling that an examination of the meaning of the being of this entity that is doing the questioning is to be a starting point in ontology. Heidegger views his predecessors as having left the meaning of being unclear, and his method will involve prioritizing the choice of the being of the inquirer as something to make transparent in his own being. Heidegger marshals three premises to justify his contention that a fundamental ontology, he says, must be sought in the existential analytic of Dasein. The first is that Dasein, rather than being just another entity, is ontically or factually distinguished by the fact that in its being is an issue for it. Dasein, in other words, comports itself to its being on some level, confronts it, and it is characteristic of it to do so, without or prior to any inquiry. The ontical, in Heidegger's terms, signifies concerns with entities and the facts about them, such as in the empirical sciences, rather than the ontological, which concerns itself with the meaning of being. In science, we progress without question of how to interpret the being of what is studied. But outside of science, we can ask about the meaning of being. And thus, Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. The second premise is that in its essence, Dasein having its being to be, and as its own, takes a further form in Dasein always understanding itself in terms of its existence, in terms of its possibilities to be itself or not itself, in what it chooses, gets itself into, or grows up in already. Whether by taking hold or neglecting, each Dasein decides its existence and the question gets straightened out through existing. These are ways in which Dasein will deal with or take a stance on its being, one way or another. Through and along this existing in this way, the understanding that Dasein gains about itself, Heidegger calls existential as an adjective, or noun-wise, an existentialer. This is an understanding that we obtain without requiring an ontological structure to be theoretically transparent to us. By contrast, the analytic of Dasein will be existential, although it will have its roots in the existential. The third premise is that Dasein also comports itself to entities of a character other than Dasein. It understands those entities, uses these entities for its purposes, and develops sciences. Dasein comports itself to a world with a pre-ontological understanding of being, and conceives of a world in which the being of those entities is accessible. These three premises, that being a Dasein is effectively a condition for making any ontology possible, that it has an ontological nature of having an understanding of itself in terms of its existence, and its ability to ontically comport itself to the being of entities that are not Dasein together make it, more than any other entity, the first to be interrogated.